First of all, I apologize that this is in English and not in Spanish. But if I were to speak in Spanish, it would last about 5 seconds. But the other thing I have to say as a judge is that I'm not allowed to say anything political. So if anything I say sounds political, it's just the acoustics in this room. It really isn't me at all. The topic I'm going to speak on today is not one that I thought I was going to speak on, because I was asked to do it yesterday evening. The topic I'm speaking on tomorrow I had about 2 or 3 weeks to prepare. This is coming straight out of my head. I am not an expert in immigration, although it's part of international humanitarian law. My expertise is in individual criminal responsibility in criminal law. But first and foremost, having said those things, what I have to say is it's an honor to be here. I have a confession to make. It's not only my first time in Paraguay, but it's my first time in South America, which at my age is a shameful admission to have to make. But I hope it's not my last trip to South America, and you may regard that as a hint if you are looking for someone to come and speak to. Last night we went to the museum and we saw the countries from which a lot of immigrants came to Paraguay. There weren't, as far as I could see, any from the United Kingdom. But when I go home and I tell people what a lovely country this is, and what beautiful people they are, and how well I've been treated, I think you may have to build a second airport, because I think you may have some British immigrants. Especially now that we're likely to leave the European common market. I regard that as insanity, but I can't say it because it's political. Immigration, well, I had to think about it hard and fast. And the more I thought about it, staring at the ceiling last night, as I lay on my bed trying to remember the law that I had learned, was that it's actually part of all of our histories. Since hominid man got up on his and her hind legs and walked out of the African Rift Valley tens of thousands of years ago to colonize other parts of Africa and eventually come to Europe and Asia, we have all, to some extent, been immigrants. And we all share a multitude of genetic patterns. Looking at me, you probably won't believe that my great-great-grandmother was half Indian, from Kashmir, up in the north of India. I inherited the Norwegian side of my ancestry rather than hers. But it's just indicative of how we are genetic migrants as well as action migrants. And the whole history of man is really that. And even colonization, with all its horrors and defects, is part of the migration process. There's voluntary migration, there's forceful migration, and there is migration simply by circumstance. So it's something that's within us, and there are many countries in the world that simply wouldn't exist without immigration and migration, not least the United States of America. It was famous for being a welcoming country, the home of the brave, the land of the free, and they poured in through Ellis Island and other places to get into the country, and it's continued ever since. It's the same in my own country, the United Kingdom. I have a house in England near to the city of Leicester, which is 54% immigrant, mainly Muslims from East Africa and from Bangladesh and from Pakistan. And we have wonderful racial relations, we have wonderful interfaith relations. It can work. And it can work only if we make it. And that's part of the matrix I started to think about. But let me look a bit more about the actual law related to immigration and the socio-legal problems that are arising. There is, you may be surprised to hear, no internationally accepted binding definition of what or who is a migrant. Nobody can agree on it. Because I suppose every migrant or potential migrant is different. But it's very unsatisfactory because there are close to 200 million people in the world living outside their country of original residence, not necessarily because they want to, but because in many cases they have to. That's the population of the UK, France, and Germany combined. We're not talking small numbers. But while we take a wrecking ball to Mother Earth with all the damage that we're doing, we're also not very good at looking after our fellow men. And the immigration problems and issues and the migrant problems and issues, which are very alive in Europe as I speak, are, I'm afraid, real evidence of that. It leads to misery, it leads to exploitation. If you want to look at really good websites, which a lot of law students don't realise how good they are until they actually look at it for the first time, there is an abundance of information on the United Nations website, and there is also a wonderful amount of information on the International Committee of the Red Cross website. You can look also at the sites of the International Criminal Court, Court for the former Yugoslavia, the Court for the former Rwanda, and students, if you have a look at international law, will get an abundance of information there, and it's free. But what is the legal matrix that we're dealing with? Well, in terms of immigration, most people face national rules and regulations. If you want to emigrate to, and this is just for instance, the UK or France or England, you have to get past the border and the national regulations that apply. As a migrant, you may or may not qualify. But if you look at the standard and overarching statutory provisions or treaty provisions of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and indeed the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you will see that encompassed within all of those principles must be individual human rights and the movement of people, the freedom of people to move. Because freedom encompasses mobility. You can't expect the populations to stay completely static, and if they had, well, the world would be a very different place than it is now. So from my perspective, as a jurist and a grumpy old man, is that we owe a lot of positive things to migration and immigration. And without them, the world and most of the countries would be a poorer place. I'm going to deal with, in my talk tomorrow, about the legal effects that are going to arise out of the ever-expanding population and climate change. I've been well educated in climate change because my son is an environmental scientist. He takes his father aside from time to time, gives me a tutorial and puts me straight. But there's an inevitable correlation between an ever-expanding world population and the increase in migration and migrants. You can't have one without the other. I'll deal in more specifics on that tomorrow, but we can see it in effect at the moment in Syria and Libya and Afghanistan and Sudan and other countries where conflicts are producing vast amounts of migrants, or would-be migrants, into Europe. Well, are they migrants, you might say? Aren't they refugees? Well, there is such an interlink between the concept of a refugee and the concept of a migrant that I prefer to deal with it as one problem, as one issue. The law is different, and I'll go on to explain that in a moment. Refugee law encompasses both what's called customary law and in some legal instruments. In 1951, the UN passed a convention relating to the status of refugees, and in 1967 there was an additional protocol. There were 145 signatories to that treaty. What they say is, when they try to define a refugee, and not everybody still agrees on it, you've got to be outside your country of nationality or habitual residence. You have to have a well-founded fear of persecution because of race, sexual orientation or gender, religion, or social or political affiliations. And you have to be unable or unwilling to return to your country of origin because of a very real fear of persecution. Now, you would have thought, okay, well, if you satisfy those criteria, why would any country turn you down? Well, they do, and it's causing immense rifts at the moment in Europe. Angela Merkel in Germany has allowed something around 1 million refugees to go into Germany, and it's causing her immense political problems. It's also causing, I'm afraid, a backlash, and populist parties are clinging on to migration and refugees as a reason to start closing the doors and to change policies. And there is a rise, you may have read, of right-wing and sometimes quite violent right-wing political parties in Europe. Now, I don't speak about that as a political issue, I speak about that as a legal issue, because it is going to have an effect on how we legally are able to deal with the refugee crisis in Europe. And mark my words, it is a crisis. As many of you will know, the UK voted by referendum on a narrow margin to come out of the European Union. One of the main planks of the Leave campaign was that of immigration. And some of the most outrageous lies were told on public platforms, which, if they were told to me in court by a witness, would amount to a contempt of court or perjury. In other words, it arises very deep and divisive emotions in people. People see their jobs going, people see their way of life going, people see the certainty of their own culture disappearing. And I'm afraid some unscrupulous people have played upon that. And that's not something which is restricted to the United Kingdom. I'm afraid you're going to see that everywhere, even in some presidential elections, but I'm not allowed to say that, of course. The African Union followed up on the UN declaration with this definition of a refugee: any person compelled to leave his or her country owing to external aggression, foreign domination, or events seriously disturbing public order in either part or whole of the country of origin. And that's quite a neat and useful definition. And it was followed up on this continent in 1984 when a group of Latin American countries adopted the Cartagena Declaration, and the wording is virtually identical to the African Declaration.
It's a matter of real importance that national governments take this seriously. It's a matter of very real importance that they do not use it to excite division or hatred or prejudice. And of course it's a matter because immigration and migration are by their nature international issues. It's something that international lawyers are going to have to grasp. And the study of refugee law is frankly in its infancy. It's only been in the last 10 years that there have been master's degree courses in refugee law popping up, and there are some very good ones. And it's a subject which I would encourage any student who was thinking of either writing a master's thesis or indeed a doctoral thesis to become involved in. But it's going to be a more and more acute legal problem as the years progress. There is also the Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. That sounds a rather strange thing. It came into force in December of 1975. It's a UN resolution, a UN convention, and it deals with how you get nationality. So in a sense, it's the other side of the coin of being an immigrant or a refugee. And you get it by birth, by virtue of age, by length of residence, interestingly, never having been convicted of an offence against national security, or never having been convicted of a criminal offence where the sentence was 5 years or more. The person who applies for nationality somewhere under this convention has to have always been stateless. Well, that's a pretty difficult one, perhaps, to get over in the first place. And of course you can get nationality by parental inheritance. It says, importantly, the convention that a state shall not deprive a person of nationality if that would render them stateless, i.e. if they didn't have dual nationality. You can't render somebody stateless who is already a national of your country. And a court cannot deprive a person of statehood by any appellate proceedings by reason of racial, religious, ethnic or political grounds. So we have here the beginnings of recognition that go back right to the 1950s, and yet for a jurist and someone who started to think about it over the last, by coincidence, I was only asked to do this yesterday, but I've been thinking about this for a year because of the political problems and the socio-legal problems I can see arising in Europe, at least, out of this mass immigration from North Africa. There is the principle of non-refoulement. It means you can't return somebody to a country if they've escaped it because of persecution at home, if there's a well-founded fear that the person going back would be subject to persecution. It's the same under the UN Convention on Torture. You're not supposed to send somebody home who's fled to your country or is a legal or illegal immigrant who's come as a refugee if there is a well-founded suspicion that if they go back to their country, if they're sent back to their country, they will be subject to torture, which is, of course, abhorrent under the UN Convention on Torture. Having said that, I don't know how this translates into Spanish. It's called extraordinary rendition in the UK, and this is where people have been sent back to countries by state agencies knowing full well that there is a likelihood that they may be subject to torture. And some cynics would say, I can't say it because I'm a judge, but some cynics would say that it's been a deliberate policy for intelligence purposes to send people back to states so that they are tortured, and there have been complaints about, obviously. So these are rules partly honoured and partly ignored, and like most things in legal and political life, depend upon the circumstances and the nature of the government in place at any one time. So as international lawyers, we have to still struggle to get a more comprehensive picture of what immigration law on an international basis should look like and what refugee law should look like on an international basis. Article 33 of the 1951 Convention on Refugees says refugees can't claim the benefits of that convention where there are reasonable grounds for regarding them as a danger to the security of a country, or where the person has been convicted of a particularly serious crime. Reasonable grounds to believe. Well, that's a catch-all, if ever there was one. So if you are claiming refugee status, but there are reasonable grounds to believe that you might be a danger to security, you can't rely on the fact convention. Well, that nullifies the convention for a lot of people, and it means that with an unscrupulous government or an unscrupulous intelligence agency, of course you can say there are reasonable grounds to believe, because it's an easy thing to say and it's an impossible to disprove. You can't disprove negatives. It also applies to the interdiction of vessels. This is a very grey area. Where a vessel of refugees is on the high seas and heading to a country, can they be stopped in international waters? Is it lawful to do so? Or do you have to wait until they come into your national waters, into your national jurisdiction? That's a very grey area, and it has over the last few years been litigated more than once. So I think what we need, and what the students that we are involved with and we teach, and I do a lot of teaching, we need to find some binding international instrument, to construct some binding international instrument for migrants and refugees on a enforceable international basis. And there are so many ways that you can get reservations into international treaties that sort of enforceability is very hard to manufacture. But this is going to require, as in many things in this conference require, a new sense of priority and purpose. It's all part of the same matrix of saving the planet. The natural world needs saving, but the human world needs saving too. We need saving from ourselves, we need saving from our greed, and we need saving for our blind, insular nationalism and lack of respect for brother man. And the older I get and the more law I do, the more apparent that becomes to me. And I have dealt with some pretty horrible cases in terms of human behaviour. You try not to take it home with you, but inevitably it affects you. And you see that if we don't start regulating ourselves on an international basis in terms of migrants and refugees, we are going to be even more lost than we are already. This is a topic which engages with the most fundamental of human rights, individual human rights, the right to liberty. And as political pressures and social pressures arise with migration, you're going to see a movement away in some places from individual human rights by insecure government, by insecure political parties, who will try to persuade people that you can have collective human rights without having individual human rights. Well, I'm sorry, you can't do that, not and make it work. human rights are quintessentially an individual entitlement. They become collective only when people come together as a collection. But collective human rights means that you can abrogate individual human rights for the good of the community, the supposed good of the community. That, I'm afraid, is a bit dangerous road to take. And we can see the emergence of some political movements, some political parties, and indeed some legal thinkers who are dangerously close to that attitude. So, it's the essence of human development, migration. We should encourage it, we should support it, and we need to look after the poor people who have been left in desperate situations as a result of conflict, sometimes very avoidable conflict, where whole nations and whole cultures are forced to move because of the nature of the surrounding circumstances. You've only got to look at Syria as a classic example of this. This isn't political, this is factual. Hundreds of thousands of people being forced out of their homeland by avoidable political and military action. Lawyers aren't going to stop the avoidable political and military action. What we can do is to make sure that there is a decent and humane consequence for those people who are forced to flee. That's the first step. And that's what I would encourage students to do. What we need to do is to ensure that what is taught to students is more than the black letter law of treaties and laws, although they are exceptionally important, but to explain to them that this is part of the matrix of being a human being, that we look after each other, that we hold each other's hand, and we don't allow the sort of suffering which we've seen in the past and we see in the present. Otherwise, the future is going to be fairly bleak and dim, and there's going to have to be an effort made by international lawyers to construct legal architecture that can deal with this. I'm not an engineer, I can't build bridges. I'm not a scientist, I can't create a scientific invention. But I'm a lawyer, and lawyers can do something, and law students must do something. I mean, I'm the past, I'm the present, I hope I'm still for a little while the future. But the real future lies, and I look down the room at some of the younger people here, and all the teaching I do, all these very extraordinarily bright young people. I taught in China in 2014 in Beijing. I taught a master's class in international criminal humanitarian law, and the Chinese students had learnt English and French in order to study international law. Boy, they're smart. If they can do it, we can do it. But I'm not sure I can learn Chinese, I have to say. So let's teach all our students that we don't own the earth. We're merely temporary tenants and custodians. And sooner or later, the landlord is going to want property back. And woe betide us if we haven't left it in good order.